Her eyes were drawn to something glinting on the carpeted floor as Amber stood motionless in front of the slightly open living room door. A delicate gold bracelet that was unfamiliar and out of place lay discarded on the pricey rug. Amber scowled, realizing that it wasn't hers and that it definitely didn't belong to Michael, her husband, who had just told her that he would be gone for a few days on business. What disturbed her even more was the fact that she had cleaned this exact room earlier in the day, and it hadn't been there when Michael wasn't home. The house was always dead still, a suffocating calm that enveloped her like a thick blanket. However, it felt as if an invisible presence had broken through the stillness, with something or someone looming just beyond her. "Is anybody here?" She called out, her voice cutting through the stillness, trying to dispel the suffocating quiet. No answer. Only the rhythmic ticking of the wall clock, distant and monotonous, stretched time unbearably. Then Amber bent down and picked up the bracelet, her fingers brushing against the cool metal. A chill ran down her spine. Then suddenly she heard it. A faint sound. It wasn't coming from the living room, but from the hallway behind her. Footsteps, soft but deliberate, as though someone was trying to move without being detected. Her heart pounded against her rib cage, her breath catching in her throat. Someone was in the house. But how she had locked all the doors after Michael left. Amber spun around, her gaze darting toward the hallway. But it was empty. A cold draft seeped through a partially open window, stirring the curtains into a lazy dance. She tried to convince herself it was nothing, that the loneliness of the house was playing tricks on her mind. But then from the shadowed corner of the hallway, a voice emerged, low, smooth, and laced with a faint hint of mockery. "Looking for something, Amber?" She whipped around, her heart nearly stopping at the sight of Ryan, Michael's son, leaning casually against the doorway, dressed in a black t-shirt and dark jeans. His piercing gaze locked onto hers with an intensity that suggested he had been watching her for some time. "Ryan," when she said, "When did you get here?" Ryan's lips curled into a tiny sardonic smirk that prevented her from reading his mind. "Did Michael tell you yesterday, Amber?" she blurted, her voice hoarse with amazement. She swallowed hard. "No, Michael hadn't mentioned that Ryan would be coming home." The unexpected appearance of her stepson, coupled with the mysterious bracelet and the charged atmosphere in the house, made her feel as though she had stumbled into a narrative she didn't fully understand. This bracelet. She began struggling to keep her voice steady as she held it up for him to see. "Is it yours?" Ryan glanced at the bracelet, his eyes darkening momentarily before he let out a quiet chuckle. "Number. But it looks like you've stumbled onto something interesting, haven't you?" Amber wanted to press him further to unravel the threads of whatever was happening. But the cold, enigmatic look in Ryan's eyes rendered her speechless. In that moment she realized something undeniable. This house, which had once been her sanctuary, no longer felt safe. Amber tightened her grip on the bracelet as she walked back to her bedroom. Ryan had already disappeared toward the staircase, and she struggled to steady her breath. Though her mind remained in turmoil, this house, with its pristine white walls and dazzling crystal chandeliers, could not conceal the memories she had tried so hard to bury. Amber had not always been the woman she was now. Before she met Michael, she had been entirely different and strong, ambitious and fiercely independent, working in the fast-paced world of media with a demanding schedule and endless important meetings. She once believed she could have it all: a career, love, and a fulfilling personal life. But everything changed after the end of her first deeply passionate relationship with a man who left her shattered. That divorce didn't just rob her of trust in love. It left behind an emptiness that no amount of success could fill. Michael had come into her life at a time when Amber had given up on happiness. He was wealthy, composed, and offered her something she hadn't experienced in years: a promise of safety, of stability, of a life where she no longer had to struggle alone. Amber hadn't fallen in love with Michael right away, but there was a comfort in his presence, like settling into a familiar room where nothing could unexpectedly fall apart. So she said yes, convincing herself that this calm, predictable existence would be enough to heal the scars she carried. But Amber hadn't anticipated the loneliness. Michael, for all his outward perfection, had never been a man who prioritized his family. He buried himself in projects, long business trips, and endless meetings with clients. In the house he had built wasn't a home. It was a grand stage where Amber played the role of the perfect wife for the world to see: empty dinners, perfunctory conversations, and nights spent alone in a vast, silent bedroom made her feel less like a partner and more like an ornamental piece in Michael's curated life. And then Ryan arrived. Ryan was Michael's son from a previous marriage. A woman, Amber, had never met but whose presence loomed over this house like an unspoken shadow. Michael rarely spoke of his ex-wife or their past. Yet Amber felt her presence in everything, as though the ghost of her existence still lingering. Ryan was the clearest embodiment of that past Michael wanted to hide. He had grown up amid arguments and instability. Something reflected in the way he looked at the world with skepticism and detachment. Amber recalled the first time she met Ryan. He had been 18 then, freshly graduated from high school. The young man with tousled black hair and piercing eyes had made her uncomfortable from the moment she saw him. It wasn't because of any rudeness on his part, but because of the way he looked at her, like she was an intruder, someone who didn't belong in his family. Years passed, and Ryan left for college. And Amber thought she had escaped that piercing gaze forever. But now he was back, and not just as a young man anymore. Ryan had grown not only in his appearance, but in his demeanor. There was a quiet, enigmatic confidence about him, something Amber couldn't put into words. And that very confidence unsettled her. Thoughts drifted back to the bracelet in her hand. Who did it belong to? Have Ryan bring it from somewhere, or was it connected to someone she didn't know? The questions churned in her mind, but more than anything the object stirred an unsettling feeling within her, a sense that perhaps she didn't truly know what was happening in this house. Amber let herself fall onto the bed, her eyes fixed on the ceiling. The house felt like a locked box with its secrets beginning to surface slowly and inevitable, but the most terrifying truth wasn't about Michael or Ryan. It was the realization that she was losing control, not of the house, but of herself. Amber couldn't stop thinking about the way Ryan had looked at her when he mentioned the bracelet. Wasn't the look of a boy or a son. It was cold, confident, and challenging. The confusion and unease in her heart grew steadily stronger. She couldn't understand why Ryan's presence stirred such a whirlwind of emotions within her, a feeling she hadn't confronted since entering this marriage. But no matter how many times she tried to push the question aside, it haunted her like a persistent shadow. That evening the house once again descended into silence. Michael still hadn't returned. And as usual, he hadn't called. Amber sat in the living room, her eyes fixed on the television screen. Though she wasn't paying attention to the movie playing, the bracelet lay on the table before her, a silent reminder that she needed answers. But from whom? Amber didn't have to look to know it was Ryan or herself when she heard soft footsteps behind her. Perhaps the silence of the house made every little movement more noticeable. Or perhaps Ryan had become so ingrained in the heavy atmosphere that his presence was unmistakable. He entered the living room with a glass of water and sat down on the sofa across from her. The dim light from the lamp cast shadows across his face, highlighting the sharp features of the young man who had become incapable of sleeping. His voice broke the stillness, calm and low, but with a hint of something that unnerved Amber. Amber was a little taken aback by his sudden attempt to strike up a conversation with her. He had never done so before. "How about you? Is it late, Ryan? Why don't you sleep?" Amber couldn't help but agree that the calm in this place wasn't serene, and he shrugged a little before setting his glass on the table. "Perhaps it's because it's too quiet here." But his eyes met hers without hesitation or fear of that bracelet. Ryan said abruptly, his eyes flicking toward the object on the table, "You're still holding on to it." Amber felt her heartbeat slow, the tension mounting in her chest, and she tried to maintain an air of calm. It was the kind of silence that felt like a storm brewing beneath the surface. She looked at him, searching for something, an explanation, a hint, anything that might help her understand the strange discomfort growing inside her. "Are you certain? You don't know anything about it?" Ryan didn't answer immediately. Instead, he picked up his glass, took a slow sip, and then placed it back down. A faint smirk crossed his face, one that made Amber feel as though she'd just stepped into a trap. "She couldn't see. If I told you it wasn't mine, would you believe me?" His voice was soft, but there was an edge of provocation in it that Amber couldn't ignore. She opened her mouth to respond, but found herself at a loss for words. The silence between them stretched, and Amber felt herself being pulled into Ryan's gaze, a gaze that seemed to dominate the entire room. She wanted to break the tension, to say something. But before she could, Ryan stand up and move closer to her. "I think," he said, Slowly bending down to pick up the bracelet from the table, his fingers turned it over the small object, seeming to carry a weight far beyond its size. You should be careful about the things you choose to hold on to. Amber, sometimes the smallest things can change everything, he said, cut through the air like a blade, leaving Amber frozen in her seat, her heart pounding in her chest. Ryan walked away, his figure disappearing into the hallway. But his words echoed in her mind. She didn't know if he had been talking about the bracelet or something else entirely. The house sank back into silence. But this time it was no longer the deathly quiet she had grown used to. It carried a sense of anticipation, as though something had only just begun. Amber reached for the glass of wine on the table, taking a large sip. But the burning liquid did little to ease the unease gnawing at her, and for the first time she wondered, was she truly in control of this situation? Or had she already been pulled into Ryan's game? Amber couldn't sleep. The bracelet, Ryan's piercing gaze, and the veiled words he had spoken replayed in her mind like a never-ending melody. She sat upright in bed, the pale moonlight filtering through the curtains, casting soft, ghostly shadows across the room. The unease inside her swelled, as though the house itself held secrets she wasn't yet ready to uncover. She tried to convince herself that everything was fine, that Ryan's presence posed no threat. But deep down she knew something was shifting, not just in him but in her as well. Descending the stairs, Amber noticed the living room lights were still on. She paused midway down the staircase and looked toward the sofa where Ryan sat, a glass of wine in his hand, staring into the distance. At that moment he no longer appeared to be the cold, detached young man she had come to know. He looked like someone burdened by unseen pain, wrestling with an inner turmoil she had never glimpsed before. Amber felt a strange sensation stir within her, an emotion that shouldn't exist yet grew stronger with every passing second, a pull she couldn't deny no matter how much she wanted to. Couldn't sleep either, she asked softly, her voice breaking the stillness of the night. Ryan turned his head to look at her, his gaze sweeping over her as if he were weighing her presence, calculating her thoughts. How about you? Then perhaps it's the silence, she said, trying to sound casual through her voice, betraying the tension rising inside her. This house always makes me feel alone. Ryan let out a dry chuckle, a sound layered with meaning she couldn't quite decipher. Alone? You have no reason to feel alone. You have everything: money, status, and a perfect husband. Everyone out there would kill to have a life like yours. Amber frowned, sensing the bite in his words but also an unsettling truth. Do you really think everything is perfect? You don't know anything, Ryan, she said, meeting his gaze directly. This life is not what you believe. Ryan stood up, placed his glass on the table, and then approached her. His eyes darkened as he approached her, as if he were looking for answers in her soul. Then, tell me, Amber, what is causing you such unhappiness? She turned her face away, unwilling to answer. But Ryan wasn't letting her off so easily. He stepped closer, and the distance between them narrowed to just a few inches. Is it you or Michael? His question cut through her like a blade, revealing the thoughts and feelings she had worked so hard to hide. Amber didn't respond when he continued to lower his voice to a whisper that made her shiver. What is it you're really looking for? The air between them felt heavy and suffocating, as if the outside world had vanished, leaving just the two of them caught in a web of emotions that neither of them could deny. Her heart pounded. Her breath was shallow and rapid, and as she looked up, her eyes met Ryan's intense, dangerous, and penetrating gaze. Ryan leaned in slightly, his face inches from hers. Do you know what's going on here? Do you not see? We both know. Amber took a step back, but her foot struck the edge of the coffee table, stopping her retreat. We can't. Can we? She mumbled, her voice shaking as he spoke. A chilly air brushing across her ear interrupted, his eyes blazing. Or you don't want to. His words struck her like a thunderclap, leaving her breathless. Amber felt as though she was standing at the edge of a cliff, one misstep away from a plunge that would shatter everything. Yet instead of fear, she felt an inexplicable rush, a forbidden thrill she hadn't allowed herself to feel in years, if ever. And then, before she could stop herself, Ryan reached out and cued her face with his touch, gentle yet firm. The warmth of his hand spread through her body, washing away every shred of logic and restraint. Amber didn't know who moved first. But in the next moment their lips met in a kiss fierce, raw, and charged with the intensity of emotions they had both suppressed for far too long. The world around them vanished. All Amber could feel was Ryan. His breath. His close, the way he seemed to ignite something inside her that she hadn't realized was missing. But even as the kiss ended and their lips parted, both of them knew there was no going back. They had crossed a line that could never be undone. Amber stepped back, her hand covering her mouth as though to erase the evidence of what had just happened. "We shouldn't have done that," she said, but her voice lacked the conviction she had intended for. Ryan didn't answer. Instead, he just looked at her, silently conveying that this was far from finished. Amber turned and walked away, but she could still feel his eyes on her, sending shivers down her spine. She knew in that moment that nothing in this house would ever be the same again. Amber hurried out of the living room, her breath rapid, her chest feeling like it was about to explode. She didn't dare look back. I didn't dare meet Ryan's gaze again. Her legs carried her to the bedroom where the heavy door closed behind her with a decisive click. She leaned against it, her trembling hands covering her flushed face. The sensation of his lips still lingered on hers, the taste of their forbidden kiss unshakable. The realization that she had crossed a line felt like free falling into an abyss. She walked over to the mirror, staring at the woman reflected back at her. That woman was no longer the Amber she once knew. Her eyes were clouded, filled with panic and guilt, screaming to be acknowledged. Yet buried deep within those emotions were something small but undeniable, a flicker of exhilaration, a feeling she refused to admit to herself. Amber shook her head, trying to dispel the storm of thoughts swirling in her mind. But it was futile. The next morning, Amber woke up, and no matter how much she wanted to avoid it, she couldn't erase the moment. She looked out the window, the bright morning sun filtering through the curtains, making her squint at the world outside, which seemed unchanged, as if nothing had happened. But inside this house, everything was different. She could feel it as soon as she stepped out of her room. The air seemed heavier, each footstep echoing ominously in the tense silence. Ryan was already in the kitchen, sipping his coffee, his eyes fixed on his phone. But as Amber walked in, he looked up, and their eyes met. Neither of them spoke, the moment feeling much longer than it was, as if time itself had frozen Amber's cheeks. She quickly turned away, feigning to pour herself a glass of water to avoid facing Ryan's question. "Did you sleep well?" "I think," Ryan said softly, his voice almost a whisper. "We both know this won't stop." Amber stiffened but didn't turn around. She replied, trying to keep her tone even. "What about you?" Ryan didn't answer right away. Instead, he got up and carried his empty coffee cup to the sink. And with each step he took, the distance between them grew smaller. Amber felt her nerves tighten as he stopped right behind her, his breath warm against the back of her neck, freezing her in place. "It won't happen again." Her voice wavered, but she made an effort to sound strong in the hopes that it would cover up her uneasiness. Ryan looked at her with unwavering eyes, and he mimicked her mistake with a small, knowing grin on his lips. "If it was an error, why didn't you push? I left last night. Why didn't you run?" As soon as it began, Amber was unable to respond. She was unable to do so because his words cut right to the core of the truth she was too scared to confront. However, before she could take in what he had said, Ryan retreated, leaving the kitchen without saying anything more. Amber remained in her room, trying to bury herself in workbooks or anything else that would help her fill the void in her mind. But nothing was successful. Ryan's image haunted her. His eyes, his voice, the memory of their kiss replaying over and over. Amber realized she wasn't just trapped in this house. She was trapped within herself. A few days later, Michael returned. The atmosphere of the house shifted immediately, the unsettling quiet giving way to the facade of normalcy. Michael and Ryan spoke easily, like father and son catching up after time apart, while Amber forced herself to act as though nothing had changed. But every time her eyes met Ryan's, the unspoken truth between them loomed heavy, a secret they both carried in silence. On Ryan's last night before leaving, Amber stood at her bedroom window looking out at the backyard. The dim glow of the garden lights illuminated Ryan's figure as he stood motionless in the cool night air, as though waiting for something or someone. Amber knew she shouldn't, but her feet moved on their own, taking her down the stairs, each step deliberate, leading her to him. Amber, Ryan said, his voice steady as she stopped a few steps away. You can't keep denying this. Amber didn't reply. She stood there feeling the night's chill seep into her skin. And in that moment she understood that her life had irreversibly changed. She didn't know what would happen next, but she knew one thing for certain. That the story between her and Ryan wasn't over, it had only just begun.